Caro, could you maybe share with us what's driving this latest wave of AI regulation? Is it about safety or is it about control?
Depends where you are, is the answer to that question. You said a moment ago that fast-moving regulation is driving technology and companies. Actually, as with everything right now, fast-moving geopolitics, trade, tariffs, and tech is starting to shape regulation. As with everything in our lives, really the dispute between the US and China is having a huge impact on AI regulation and the industry and the technology. And those are really different AI industries. They've got very different attitudes to AI regulation. China's really heavily regulated. The US, certainly at the federal level, is less heavily regulated. The type of companies that they produce are quite different. The tech they produce is very different. And the trade war that is going on between China and the US, which has gone on for many years in this area, is really impacting how regulation is starting to take shape. And as that has kind of spilt out, as it were, into other parts of the world, areas like the EU with its AI Act is really reconsidering whether it takes a strong regulatory line, which was its original proposal, or whether it pivots slightly towards deregulation, which as of February and the competitiveness compass is what the EU was looking to do. It was looking to maybe relook again at the AI Act, but recent events have overtaken that as well. So you've got the clash of these two very, very different approaches in different tech sectors. In the midst of all that, you have the AI Act. The bulk of the provisions come into force this August. Some are already in force. So AI literacy and prohibited practices are already in force, been in since February. The bulk of provisions come in this August around general purpose models, around confidentiality and governance. But enforcement is looking a bit creaky, to be honest. Countries had until November to notify the Commission of the authorities that were going to do the various roles under the Act. So countries have to notify three types of authorities. One is a notifying body that tells the Commission about their bodies. One deals with market surveillance, which is very much product safety. The other deals with fundamental rights, so privacy and discrimination. And to date, only one country has given absolute clarity on the bodies that will fall under both of those. Of the others, we've got 10 that have given clarity on market surveillance and about 15, 16 that have given clarity on fundamental rights. So the AI Act enforcement isn't looking particularly strong. The technical standards, which I think would be the real bulk of the EU AI Act, actually, these are the standards that will set clear limits on hallucinations, on bias, on security. They've now been delayed, it seems, till 2026. We expected them April, so last month, but they've been delayed because they haven't been finalized. And as the US starts to step out of the standardization space with NIST, its main body, seeing cutbacks, it's a real opportunity for the EU to set global standards, but that's been delayed. And we've just seen a letter yesterday, I believe, Martin, that the US is asking for parts of the EU AI Act around general purpose models for enforcement to be delayed. So this is turning into a very long answer, and you said you were going to be strict on time. Essentially, that's the bulk of what is going on. Above that, you have UN General Assembly resolutions and common regulatory arrangements that are a bit more detailed. You have the OECD principles, UNESCO's framework, a Council of Europe framework on AI ethics. You have the UN Global Digital Compact, which is looking at addressing practical things like the digital divide, biases in data sets and access to compute. And then you have several countries taking slightly different approaches. So, for example, Canada and India have draft bills and voluntary codes. Australia, Japan have voluntary codes of practice. And other countries are investing very heavily in AI infrastructure, but are looking to their sectoral regulators to regulate it. Examples, particularly in Africa, like Nigeria. So what does all of that mean for AI regulation? Well, it means that companies now, it's not even a regulatory or a compliance question. It's become absolutely essential to understand your supply chain, where your technology is coming from, where your data is being hosted, who is supplying your tech, where the infrastructure is. Because now it's not just a question of complying with a particular piece of AI legislation. It's about trade, tariffs, embargoes, supply chain security, data security. It's really becoming much, much, much more fundamental, I think, to the strategy across all areas of the business to understand their technology and implement governance? That was a long question, but hopefully a short tour of global AI regulation.
I could break down, thank you very much, Caro. I could break that down and ask you several 20 more questions on it. Quick question. You said MLEX was asking yesterday for changes to be made. Who are MLEX?
So MLEX is a journalist platform. So they were
Oh, right.
reporting that the US has sent a letter to the EU Commission asking for a pause on the enforcement of the general purpose AI model provisions. So these come into force in August of this year, but it's really putting companies on notice because it's not until 2027 that companies will really be held to account if they're providing these foundation models, essentially. And the US government were asking for a pause on enforcement of those areas. So it's not clear whether that will happen. And I think broader geopolitics will play into that. And a final note, just to broaden this out even more, the background to this is the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act, which is how the EU is regulating online competition and online safety. And enforcement there is getting quite tough. We've seen big fines for Google and Meta. And so the EU is really stepping up in those areas, which is impacting AI industry and AI players, a little bit like what we're seeing in China with its tech crackdown.
Mm, yes. Well, I think that it's geopolitics is as tied up with everything as is regulation and development. What would you say to like you see a lot of kind of US business leaders claiming that regulation is going to slow things down. What are your thoughts on that in relation to AI development and where we are coming from, say, sitting in the heart of Europe?
And how do you, well, I think look at the examples that are going on from China. So China's AI industry is fascinating. I've written on this and looked at this. It's really, really interesting. But I think the main lesson from the DeepSeek R1 model, from the Manus system, first autonomous AI agent that's coming out of China and how their
Love it.
tech sector operates, is that heavy regulation constraints. China has over 40 rules and regulations around AI, including their Gen AI requirements, which hit the headlines when DeepSeek was launched. But they have a very, very tightly constrained environment. They've had lots of embargoes around microchips and processing power. Yes, there is a lot of government investment in the AI industry, but a lot of crackdown on monopolistic behavior. So companies don't have access to massive resources. They don't have access to huge compute, and they're really tightly regulated in their reporting and what they're able to do. And yet we're seeing some of the most efficient models coming out of the Chinese market with DeepSeek's use of distillation, model of experts, etc. So I think the example certainly that we're seeing from China is that regulation actually is kind of the mother of all innovation.
Caro, thank you for that. We will definitely be coming back to you with a few more questions at the end of this. I'd just like to move it over to Lee now. Lee, if I was asking you to think about the issues that I'd need to consider in developing a strategic roadmap for aligning AI with values and IP as well as regulation, where would you even begin?
Yeah, thanks very much, Mary Rose. So, building a business objective is really kind of an opportunity to take a step back. So, according to Gartner, around about 85% of AI projects actually fail. And the reason for that is because businesses are not aligning the AI projects. It's almost like they're treating AI projects as something that is a novelty and not necessarily seeing it as a strategic opportunity to accelerate their business. So just as an old case study, so this is kind of going back to kind of the late 2010s, essentially, where UPS developed AI technology at the time to be able to actually reduce the amount of time it took for the last mile delivery. And in that instance, they saved nearly 100 million miles. And this is old school, old tech. And when we talk about old school, old tech, basically pre-2022 kind of thing, right? Yeah. And since then, they've, of course, improved on that and started in basically adding in AI models to contextualize weather information, traffic pattern information, and any other elements that they can use to kind of reduce that amount of time. So essentially what they've done is they would be able to reduce on carbon footprint, wear and tear on the vehicles, improve customer satisfaction, reduce strain on employees, just using that example, right? And those would all be core values that an organization would want to achieve, both from a customer perspective, an employee perspective, as well as from a saving time, money, and resources, right? So when you are considering a AI strategic plan, you need to think about what would be the value the organization is wanting to achieve with that particular application. And the way in which you would want to do something like that is almost crowdsource it. So you would establish an AI committee, also incorporate an AI ethics committee, and that will allow you to bring together multiple business leaders in the organization to identify opportunities for the use of AI to achieve the overarching strategic objectives. So once you've identified the strategic, or once you have the strategic objectives, you've identified a series of potential AI projects that will meet those strategic objectives, you can then start testing them, right? And the way in which you would want to test them is, do I have the required data? Do I have the required infrastructure? Do I have the required team in order to be able to do that? And at that point, you would then be able to say, right, based on the feasibility study, this would be the ideal project that I could pilot. And in that piloting process, you would then identify potential issues within the team, the data, the application, the infrastructure. And once you're at that point, you can say, right, I'm now ready to scale. And again, you wouldn't just test one, you might test 2 or 3 while you're in there. And because you're getting that additional learning, it's moving beyond the novelty, and you're now actually inculcating actual knowledge around AI development, the kind of potential pitfalls that you're going to have, as well as additional opportunities that you may not have identified on paper. And then it's going into production, right? So now we'll be moving beyond pilots, scaling it up, implementing the required security, governance, controls, and also integrating into existing technologies and platforms, because that's typically where the plan hits the first real challenge: is how am I going to integrate all of these different disparate systems, both, typically archaic, underdeveloped, under-resourced old solutions with these newly minted AI applications. And then the last pieces of the puzzle would be adoption. So this is where the change management comes in, the people management comes in, the education, the AI literacy training, and from there, it would be monitoring. So, we had the view of what we wanted to achieve in terms of the overarching strategic objectives. We had identified the AI applications that we wanted, and now what we would want to put behind that is, have we hit it? Are we hitting the KPIs that we set for ourselves in this ambitious project? So going back to UPS, if the example was we wanted to reduce time and effort, we wanted to reduce our carbon footprint, we wanted to reduce potential wear and tear on the vehicles, and we wanted to increase customer satisfaction, did we hit those? Did we hit those metrics as we were going along? So the reason why I used quite an old case study is because we've actually known this. We know how to do this. There are real examples of how to do it. And just because the language has slightly changed, the technology has slightly changed, we've still got the governance capability and the frameworks and the management frameworks in place to be able to tell us how we can basically bring in new technologies and reduce risk. On the IP question, though, that's a slightly different slant, right? So when we're thinking about intellectual property, I would basically the key there is that it has to be human created. It's human intelligence that essentially is wrapped in intellectual property law. So if it is not a creation of the mind, then there isn't necessarily the required kind of patent laws that would be able to protect it. So an example of this is Zara of the Dawn. In 2022, they actually had an issue around copywriting, where they used images generated in Midjourney, and their copyright, or part of their copyright, was actually removed because of that. Now, in Ireland, when you create music or books or software, you automatically get you're automatically protected by copyright laws. So it's slightly different, but the point is that it's not a creation of the mind. So when you're thinking about your copyrights or your creations, essentially, you need to think about it in kind of 4 areas. That would be patents, trademarks, copyright, of course, and then trade secrets. So the trade secrets we'll put to one side, but it's still very important because you need to make sure that you are actually protecting your intellectual property from the very start. So that would be how are you actually sourcing your data? Does it have any copyright information inside that data? And if you do, how are you licensing it? How are you managing the risks associated to that? And also when it comes to patents as well. Then you talk about it on the output of AI. So if you are using generated AI in the development of applications, you're essentially it's not necessarily a creation of the mind there. So there is also a potential issue relating to copyright laws. So again, you need to be able to, if it's co-developed with AI and you're making those modifications, then it is of the mind. It is a creation of the mind. So the key there is, again, strong governance. You need to have a layered governance. You need to show the process of how it was created, the decision points that were made during the creation process. You might also want to document the design development of the actual applications, and the design is really important, and also where it was designed. So, do you have officers in Ireland designing, developing the solutions that will then provide the copyright legislation wrapping around it? So those would be the things that you would typically want to consider when you are putting in place an AI technology platform that is actually aligned to your strategic objectives.
I'm listening to that, Lee. Thank you so much. I'm thinking there are the things that I might want to consider, but everybody who's watching, you might actually just consider contacting Lee and the team at Saros who can guide you through this process. It sounds like there are a lot of factors that need to be considered. And luckily, people like yourself have a lot of experience in delivering many, many projects in this space. I guess I would ask you a question. It's the tool question, are there, like, I know it's early days, like, are there kind of frameworks and tools that you can use or that we can use to mitigate the AI risks with confidence? What's been your experience working on projects in the past, Lee?
Yeah, so I mean, when it comes to tools, I would actually almost flip the question, which is, what are my risks?
Right.
Because your risks would actually define what tool sets, what frameworks you use, right? So when I think about AI and risk, I kind of put it into kind of 4 pillars. So the first one is ethics and alignment. The second one is regulation. The third one is missed opportunities. And the fourth one is complexity. Okay. So if we think about it in those terms, you then kind of break it down into 2 more categories. One is business controls and the other one is operational controls. Okay. So when you're thinking about business controls, these would be the first place where you might have tools. And one of the easiest tool is actually just an AI policy. You might not think about it as a tool, but it technically is a tool with which to use within the business to set conformity around the way in which AI is going to be used to add value to your business, to your customers, to your employees. Other wider tools that would form part of that would be things like management systems. So that would be NIST, as an example. Caro mentioned that, and 42001, which is an ISO standard, which has actually been around since 2023 now already. And then you might also want to start thinking about other things, and it could be as simple as an Excel spreadsheet, but having an AI system inventory, having a data set inventory, in implementing a policy management system. And again, this is not necessarily new, but it would form part of it. So you would also want to have policies around copyright. You would want to have policies around your AI, around roles and responsibilities, around the life cycle development of an AI application. You would also want to have things like audit trails and explainability tools. So when we get down into the next layer, so now that we've got the kind of the business layer or the business controls considered, if you get down into the technology layers, you would have things like Fiddler AI, and these would be around basically observability. There's the word.
Well done.
Of your machine learning models. Things like Risk Copilot would be around compliance software to the EU AI Act. So again, AI assets, classifying your assets, identifying what policies, procedures would be needed. Logigate is a standard risk management, like GRC type solution. And again, they would be able to cover or at least align your control sets with your risks and your objectives, and then also be able to identify, what would be your risk tolerance within your organization, because your risk tolerance and your tool set selection also plays a big role in doing that. The last couple that I want to maybe just kind of highlight would be around IBM's AI Fairness. I think that's been around since 2016, 2017. It's been around for a very, very long time. You've also got the Ethical OS, again, really nice framework. You've also got tool sets from the big players, for example, Microsoft, in terms of machine learning. And then you've also got Azure in terms of SageMaker. But again, it kind of comes back to what is your strategic objectives? And based on those strategic objectives, you would then identify where you're wanting to leverage AI. And then based on where you want to leverage AI, your tool sets for the design, development, and implementation of your AI, and then your control sets to mitigate any kind of issues would then also be determined based on your strategic guidance. So again, it's not going to be a one size fits all for everybody. It's going to almost start at the very top at the strategic level, and you're going to bake it all the way down into the individual controls, and then select the best tool to support you on addressing that control. Because what you want to do is minimize your risk. And the only way you're going to be able to do that is identifying your risks, setting your risk tolerance levels, and then actually monitoring whether or not your risk tolerance levels are coming down in the design and development of that. And I just want to mention one thing here, just in terms of Safe Rent, is a company out of the US. They developed an algorithm that would help businesses select potential tenants for landlords. And that particular platform was fined 2.2 million in 2024, in November of 2024. And the reason for that is that they had bias inside the algorithm that was biasing against Black and Hispanic tenants or potential tenants. And it's not like they didn't know this. And the fact is they didn't take a risk-based approach to identifying where that potential risk could be. And if they had done that, they potentially would have been able to identify tools and techniques that would be able to reduce their risk. There's one last point that I want to add around missed opportunity. So I know it's not necessarily a tool set, but I want to leave a thought process here, which is around 50% of products that we will use in the future will be created by businesses that do not exist today. So if you're not implementing AI and you're not considering both the core business risks, you're not considering the technology risks, and you're not considering the business controls, then you're going to be one of those businesses that is not going to be delivering services in the next few years.
That's a very good point to end on. Lee, thank you very much. I think one of the key things I wrote down there was like, there is no one size fits all. We're all just working out the opportunities. And I think, I think Saras can really play a very strong role here in helping organizations move from the planning through the testing, the piloting, the production, all of those stages that you very clearly laid out. So thank you very much for that. Moving on to Gareth. Gareth has a lot of experience on implementation in Microsoft in his role there. Gareth, would you like to first begin by sharing, I suppose, Microsoft's approach to going from, a policy on paper to a real lived governance example, please?
Yeah, sure. I can kind of go into some of the nitty-gritty details on how we
yes, please. We love nitty-gritty.
And obviously, I work on the deployment of data platforms and AI solutions for large multinational companies on our cloud platform, Azure. So, with that view, obviously, AI governance for me actually means hands-on keyboards and how those policies actually get fed into the development of solutions. And essentially, for us, when we're doing this, AI governance aims to balance, say, the technology advancement with ethical considerations and regulatory compliance when we're deploying solutions. Now, there's obviously been a lot of hype around AI and how it's going to work. But from a Microsoft perspective, I can actually just tell you that it is very, very real. It is dominating the discourse within Microsoft as a company. The culture has even changed in response to what's happened over the last few years.
Yeah.
And even working with partners, we're seeing a huge amount of people uplifting and looking for AI solutions. We've seen industry reports where people have seen a doubling of the people working on AI in the last 6 months. We have studies on our Copilot deployment, which means basically people are saving around 30 minutes per day. We're seeing a value return on some of these industry reports of maybe for every dollar invested, you get 3.5 in return. And all that is underpinned by our cloud solution. Now, I like kind of talking about the cloud because that's where I actually work in a good bit of detail, but to give people a sense of the scale of what's happening, right, on Azure, we've got 60 plus regions. Each region's got multiple data centers. We're averaging a new data center once a week. In the last quarter, we announced 10 new countries with new data centers. If you look at the amount of fiber we've deployed, we can go to the moon and back 3 times.
Wow.
This is huge, incredible infrastructure. We recently had our reports, annual financial reports last night. So we made 26 billion on our Azure Intelligent Cloud platform. We've also invested 21 billion on CapEx to develop new infrastructure. All of this is going towards AI investment. And if we think about that from a governance perspective, it's vital that we build a governance structure and a framework to allow us to deploy those tools internally, but also to make them available. And if you actually look at, say, the recent announcement by Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, on building a European cloud sovereignty system so that we can actually adhere to some of the regulations and the governance processes that are now coming on stream. Within Microsoft as well, we obviously have our AI principles and our responsible AI and our governance. The Microsoft AI governance is built off the National Institute of Standards and Technology and their artificial intelligence risk framework. What that means when we're building solutions is we have a strategy in place in terms of an overriding AI strategy that develops into an AI plan, that develops into AI ready, and then into a governance, and then into a management, and then into the security aspects. Then underpinning that is an AI readiness and an AI foundation and a design of AI workloads. And then underpinning all of that in terms of how we build and deploy first-party solutions and how we advise to build third-party solutions is our responsible AI principles. And these come down to, I think, around 6 principles, if I can remember it off the top of my head: fairness, reliability and safety, privacy and security, inclusiveness, transparency, and accountability. And they cover how we work. A good example of that would be kind of anyone's looked at Microsoft 365 Copilot. There's a nice little tab on the top between web versus work. That's there for transparency so that people can understand when they're actually looking at their internal documentation or when they're sending queries out to the web. Again, a simple button, but again, reflecting the principles we hold. When we have pre-baked models that we deploy or offer to customers, we know that all of them have undergone that process that I've talked about, say, for example, our vision models. When it comes to third-party solutions, it becomes slightly more complicated in that now that the governance becomes a cross-party responsibility. We obviously hold a certain level of responsibility on the platform and any of our first-party toolings. But if you're deploying in large language models, say, for example, ChatGPT or the OpenAI services or one of the various tens of models, 10s to 20s to 30s that we now actually offer, the onus on the governance of those models actually then can kind of be split across the parties. But we can provide tooling that you mentioned earlier to kind of help address some of that. And the data is critical in this as well, but so is security. And security is one of the primary kind of concerns we have in and around Microsoft and how we go about doing it. We actually invest over $1 billion annually into cybersecurity. We've got around 3,500 specialists in this. We recently did a simple study that we now have probably around 7 trillion cyber attacks annually hitting Microsoft infrastructure. And so we need to take care of that to secure AI services that we deliver. Interestingly enough, I think around 99.9% of those attacks that actually get through, not onto our systems, but globally, can be prevented with multi-factor authentication. So again, that becomes part of our processes and our policies. And in essence, we work off a zero trust policy in terms of verify explicitly, least privilege access, assume breach. And then under those, then we've got various different pillars. And at the moment, we are running the biggest global or ever security foundation initiative within Microsoft called SFI. And everybody is involved in it, right away from HR, support staff, not just cybersecurity experts. And that is basically enforced inside the company through a huge amount of training on security and the AI principles at all levels. So there's a consistent knowledge base across the company and a real good understanding how to ensure compliance with security in our AI governance models. That is critical for building trust and deploying solutions with our industry partners, which is where I really do most of my work. And interestingly, when we're doing the hands on the keyboard, we don't necessarily talk about governance as a direct topic. We actually talk about governance within subtopics. So security, value, technical data governance, the skills, scaling, and agentic AI now is another big topic. For my work, what I've seen in terms of the main AI workloads are in and around documentation, reporting, and knowledge transfer. I work on a lot of technical, we'd call traditional machine learning workloads, which has different kind of governance structures to the documentation. There's a lot of IoT and OT data, which again has a different level of governance. And then there's the first party co-pilots where people are deploying. But we usually get listed with a lot of kind of common questions in and around those buckets. From security, kind of top of mind that people usually ask is, how do I optimize the cybersecurity program to best protect my organization? And the general answer we have to that is that the proactive threat management approach. We have regular risk assessments, and improving the endpoint detection and responses is critical. And then education of employees is really kind of the key to that. However, on the security side of stuff, really it's specialist supply here. So if you want to have a good framework and a good program, a successful program, you need to get the specialist supply. Practical example of that is we're actually working on a live program where we're building an agent to sit on technical data, technical manuals to allow people to get faster access to that. The vast majority of that work has been based on the security aspects on the network design, based on that company's policies that they have in place. We could have deployed it in the space of a few hours, a few days, but because of the governance processes, and I'm not saying it's a negative that it took long, so it's a positive, because then we've got a stringent solution in place that we can trust because we've worked through the systems.
That's really good, Gareth. And like actually just speaking to that point, like this need for speed, you know, I think we need to start learning more a little bit about like slow down and make sure that we're actually getting the security right and the governance right.
Yeah, absolutely. And the speed and the governance aspect of it is critical across all of the work that we're doing. It comes down to even in terms of, say, the technical and data governance. When we do these designs on technical data, we have to make sure that they're aligned with the policies and the regulations and the business requirements. And that is critical to success. And what we see when we're building solutions on these AI workloads is that in terms of the technical data and speeding up, building a comprehensive data model is really important. You build a consistent data platform, then that allows you to accelerate because you've now actually wrapped that up inside your policies, and therefore your data is readily accessible and available. So building the AI model on top of that becomes relatively quite easy. Another good example of how we're doing that practically is Microsoft have engaged with a specific industry where there's 200 industry partners all involved in building a common data platform and a common data model inside that data platform. So therefore, everybody in industry is working off the same hymn sheet, which allows us to accelerate and take third-party solutions on top of it. It is critical. As well as I said, figuring out the business requirements that feed back into governance. Another example would be when we're trying to build a field-based solution. So people are at risk in the field doing a manual operations. The accuracy requirements now on the model are looking for 99.9%. That is a governance and regulatory requirement for the safety of people, but it imposes a level of scrutiny on top of the solution that the AI builds versus another solution in the same company where the accuracy does not have to be that much because it's office-based work. That basically feeds into having the requirement to have flexibility and technology match the governance and vice versa as we build these solutions.
Wow. Can I ask you a question actually? Like what would be one myth about governance that you know that is not true based on all of your experience working on multiple projects within Microsoft?
The one myth that I really kind of come across is that I think that it can be siloed into different teams, that you can have people working on legal, HR, IT, and they can do their own little component, and then they can deliver that to the broader company, and that can cascade down to people. What we found that when you have these people together in the room from day one, all working off the same team sheet, as I said, allows for people to accelerate quite quickly. So no, you can't segment it in terms of that. And it's, to me, it's not like static legal requirements like employment law or product safety. And even though there is an overlap for that, these requirements and governance have to be flexible because the technology is changing so quickly. There's technology now that we're starting to deploy that wasn't here 2 years ago. But if the governance and the frameworks preclude the speed of development, we can't get access to the technology quite quickly. So it needs to be flexible. And that's one of the myths that I would kind of challenge as well, is that the EU Act is flexible and people should not be scared of that.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point. That's a really good point. Thank you very much for answering that. So that is three really interesting perspectives on the area of AI governance. I suppose I would put a question to all three of you just right now and just actually, I suppose, draw out from your own perspective. We're seeing that there's kind of like, from listening to each of you, there is quite a lot of complexity at play. There's quite a lot of identifying the best possible approach for your own individual organization at play. But I suppose drawing on the more positive thing, what would be what do you think is the competitive advantage from getting this right and from taking a very, very holistic view to doing it right from the start? What are the benefits that businesses can expect? If each of the three of you would like to answer from your own various different perspectives, that'd be great.
I can kind of give my first overview. That's okay.
Off you go there, Gareth. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. So certainly for me, but the competitive advantage of getting your governance in place is it removes barriers to adoption. I think that's the top thing for me. If it's done properly, then you can build solutions quite quickly. When I've seen it done badly, it does stall everything. And it's also very much directly related to the ability to scale AI and add additional workloads. A lot of the initial kind of AI builds are POCs to MVPs before they go into production. If the governance isn't done correctly, then it's very hard to jump across those gates in terms of moving from a POC to production. So that's where I see the competitive advantages.
Very good. Lee, what do you think from your perspective?
So probably the best way for me to think about this is you're trying to get a product to market, you're trying to create efficiencies inside your organization. If you don't actually have a defined plan in order to be able to achieve that and metrics to determine whether or not that's a success, it really will always be a toy. It will always be a novelty thing that you're playing with and you haven't quite figured out what you're doing. If you ever started up a new business and you haven't quite figured out what your customers want, is there value in the creation of that, you're ultimately never going to get out of the blocks. And if you do find a client base to be able to accept that, you can't ever scale if you don't have the required systems in place in order to be able to meet that. So it kind of taps into what Gareth was saying, is that the governance building blocks basically create the systems in order to be able to get the multiplying effect of AI. Because if you don't have that, you are literally going to be using a very powerful tool as a fool.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's the last thing you want to be doing. And then, Caro, from your perspective, what have you seen from the multinationals that you've worked with in terms of the immediate benefits that can be had from taking the right approach and getting this right?
I think AI's kind of shifted the dial even further. So I think the key with good AI governance is, one, it gives you good insights into what you're doing, why you're doing it, what the benefits are. It gives you that good financial oversight, the geopolitical risk. It allows you to see your supply chains. It's going to give you a good overview of your technology. But also, I think with AI, because we're talking about systems that need, as Gareth was saying, good data, good quality data, good inputs, and as Lee was saying, a good strategic fit with your company, else you'll waste huge amounts of resources or miss out on an opportunity. Good governance is going to give you those things. It's going to give you the fact that your tech is fitted to your strategy, your data is ready and in place to allow that technology to operate. It's going to keep you agile because your data will be in good shape. So if you need to shift systems, you can. And it's going to mean that you as a company, as a manager, as a board member, are aware of exactly what your tech does, what its benefits are. You can keep on top of its KPIs, and you can understand your supply chain risk and exposure in the event of a global shock, which frankly right now are becoming less shocking. They're happening so often. So for me, it's insights and it's fit. It means you're using the right tech for the right tool.
Very good. Yeah, very good. Very Lee, would you mind just calling out the first question, because mine is kind of hanging. I'm just going to solve that issue while we're asking the questions.
Not a problem. So this one is
Thank you.
actually geared towards Lee. And the question goes, based on business use cases, is there a way, excuse me, to identify potential opportunities, as in there is a fundamental change within the industry and it might affect the actual underlying business model? And again, we probably have, if we look back at history, we've seen a few of these examples. So kind of the poster childs of those examples would be things like Kodak or BlackBerry or Xerox. And I know these are kind of the poster childs that we all throw up when we know that there is been a kind of a technological change. But the other one would be kind of, I think one of the areas that is being affected is autonomous vehicles. I think that is going to become a potential real change. We're starting to see that quite a bit in the US and specific states. There is a growing opportunity there, but also a potential risk from a societal perspective. We're also seeing the advent of drones and the autonomous view, or basically the automation and creation of autonomy around drones. So again, there are certain areas that are potentially at risk. The other one is just something that I want to throw in there from a kind of a shift. So back in the 80s, ATMs were put out into the market. Late 70s, early 80s. And there was a real view at that point that basically branches would actually shut down. But what actually ended up happening was that there was actually an increase in branches. There was an increase in tellers, even as ATMs kind of moved out into the marketplace. So we mustn't just assume that technology is going to have a complete disruption on jobs. There is an opportunity there. So I think those are just some of the things that I want to highlight. But the answer to the question is without understanding that specific industry, it's very difficult to kind of say that these would be massive market changes or that would kill specific markets or change the actual business models associated to it. But maybe one other point that I want to add is as small businesses are created, especially around tech businesses, one of the biggest barriers to entries was being able to have infrastructure because of the cost of infrastructure, and cloud changed that. And when cloud came along, we had this kind of mushrooming of kind of micro tech cloud-based businesses that were able to create real value very quickly. And I see that again happening with AI, but there is also a potential that we might start to eat our own tail as AI starts to potentially change the financial models that would be in place for those cloud-based systems. So yeah, those would be just some of the areas that I would be concerned about.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. I hope that answers your question, David. We have another question from Liz. It's a great question. I'd like to put it to all three of you on the panel. what are the general opportunities in the health sector, considering that there has been traditional underdevelopment and investment there in ICT in general for many years? So question is, general opportunities in the healthcare sector. Would anyone like to answer that question?
I can come in. It kind of links to the last one, actually. So in terms of keeping on top of how do you keep your competitive intelligence up? I think getting to events, coming on something like this is a great start. But things like the ITU's AI for Good, AI UK with Alan Turing, these events that perhaps as a company traditionally you might not have gone to, you'd have seen it as more a tech specialist event, I think is a great way to try to look at what is the tech coming down the line, and also looking at academic research. So more generally, and I realize this is a healthcare question, but more generally, there's some fascinating research coming out of King's College on the effect on workers of AI in the workplace and what is happening to people who have AI adoption and what's happening around burnout, and some interesting and counterintuitive findings there. So I think having a broad spectrum of your competitive intelligence is key. In the health sector, I've seen I'm not a healthcare specialist, so some incredible things around digital twins, 3D printed hearts, means of testing drugs on a digital twin or a model of someone, or testing surgical procedures to see if it would work for you on something that's a copy. Personally, from speaking to people who work in the healthcare sector and being a patient and user of services, I think the biggest opportunity is admin. I think, as boring as that sounds, and remote robot surgeons operating from across the globe, as we saw a few weeks ago, are incredible. I think helping doctors and nurses with their administrative side to get accurate notes and accurate records and accurate admin, I think, is the big opportunity for healthcare. That's what doctors say, that's what nurses and healthcare professionals say is the big gap. And I think it does tie into a general point around AI being a solution to a problem, not a solution looking for a problem, but a solution to what people really need. And I think companies speaking to people who work in that sector, in that industry, and then looking at research of the impact of technology when it's introduced, I think is how to get the best out of AI.
That's a really good answer, Caro. Aidan Walsh has a very good question here and comment, which is that organizations should look at AI adoption and at the AI engines that they're choosing to allow, and that we should really start looking at our choice of AI tools in the same sort of way as we look at how we choose a strategic supplier for the organization. That's, I think, a very good point. And Aidan asked the question of, should we allow AI adoption, but really control what kind of tech is permitted? And what are the panel's thoughts on this particular aspect?
If I can, I'll step in there. So very much so. We need to see all AI tools, especially kind of the selection of your general purpose model if you're using it within kind of an agentic workflow architecture. So in that space, we should use all of the third-party risk management tool sets that we have available to us. So that would be doing a due diligence on that organization, also considering where they are from a geopolitical perspective. We might also want to consider things like being able to hot swap specific components within our architecture, so that if there is an issue, we can actually just pull them out and bring them back in again. So that means also considering from a framework perspective, and again, it comes back to the governance piece, which is selecting technologies, selecting tool sets that you're using in the development of it, so that you're not locked in with specific frameworks. So you don't want to necessarily be kind of either selecting US-based firms or EU-based firms or Asia-based firms. It allows you to then manage your risk, as well as that sort of geopolitical risk that Caro has highlighted, as well as in kind of bringing in the best of breed technologies as they are right now. Because what is really good right now, if you think about back to 2022, it was ChatGPT. It's now kind of moved further along, and it's potentially now Gemini as the underlying model. So again, it's horses for courses, but the most important thing is being able to hot swap each one of those components within your application, and very much take a third-party risk management approach to the selection of your tool sets, and again, following that risk-based approach.
Very
Sorry,
good.
can I just add to that as well?
Sorry,
Because that's an excellent point from Adrian in terms of the way these are working. And there is practical demonstrations of the work we do and how that is being orchestrated. Obviously, Microsoft are a platform company, so we allow a significant number of third-party models to be deployed within our infrastructure. But working with some of these companies, they are only allowed to deploy a very small subset of those because of the governance structures and the assessment they've done on them internally. And then back to Lee's point, they're building solutions that are modular so that when a new model comes and it passes the very checks that are imposed on it from the AI governance perspective, it can then become deployed. It's not as if people are picking it, because it is a significant worry in the security context of shadow AI. I think there's a recent study where they've had something like 80% of executives are really worried about how deployment of bring your own models from staff are impacting their business and the unknown implications for that.
Yeah, that's a very real fear. When I hear about shadow AI, I break out in hives immediately. That's great. Somebody was asking a question about will there be a summary of this meeting? And just to say that not only that will be a recording of the meeting sent out, but Francine and the great team at Saros will be taking the transcript of the video and they'll be turning it into a wonderful ebook summary, which will be winging its way to you very soon. So thank you very much for your interest in receiving that. I would like to thank everybody for taking part, but of course to our three speakers for the amazing insights that they have brought. Thanks also to Saros for hosting this.